Hello, everybody. I have a very big topic to cover here in a short amount of time, so I'm going to really just try to give you the bare bones, and it'll get filled in throughout the day as we go through all the case studies and things that we'll be talking about. So how many of you have worked with the standards very much, or how many of you, let's say, how many of you are kind of new to using the standards? Okay, so most of you have some experience with the standards, at least. So what we are going to do is talk about the 4 treatment approaches and a little bit about each of the, sorry, let's see. We're going to talk about each of the treatment approaches, and then for some of them we'll give more detail than others because some of them are going to be more relevant or less relevant to what we're doing today. So you might recognize this book, the cover of which is up here. This is the Secretary of the Interior Standards for the Treatment of Historic Properties with guidelines for preserving, rehabilitating, restoring, and reconstructing historic buildings. So as you know, most of us, most of the time, are using the rehabilitation standards, but we'll go through those 4 treatment approaches first, because when you're starting a project, this is one of the first questions that you're asking. What are you trying to achieve? Which are these standards are you going to apply? And the standards, you know, there's some overlap, of course, among all the standards, all the sets of standards. But essentially, you have to decide what your treatment approach is before you know what's appropriate to actually plan for. So starting with the standards for preservation. So as this says, preservation is the act, defined as the act or process of applying measures necessary, excuse me, to sustain the existing form, integrity, and materials of an historic property. So you're not trying to make any big changes to the property. You're not trying to perform any kind of rescue mission. You're just trying to stabilize it and make sure that it continues to maintain the appearance that it has, maintain the function that it has, and you know, to basically sustain the resource at its best. Sorry, I'm having trouble like finding places to put things. Okay. Oh, okay. Oh, there we go. Okay. Oops, sorry, we went back. Okay, so it says that work including preliminary measures to protect and stabilize the property generally focuses on the ongoing maintenance and repair of historic materials and features rather than extensive replacement and new construction. So the example that I have here for you of a preservation project is the Huntington Mausoleum, which we worked on about 6 or 7 years ago, I think, at ARG. And this is a historic photo of it right here. And this is a photo of some of the work that was done. So you can see what some of the conditions were. The building basically looked the same as it did historically. It didn't have any major, you know, obviously no one had done any additions to a mausoleum, although I suppose that could happen if you were trying to accommodate more family members. But the population of the mausoleum is pretty stable. It's just the 2 of them in there. And then you can see that there were some kinds of losses where pieces had just sort of fallen and then they'd put them in containers and sort of save them from when they could do the work. There was a lot of water intrusion, which was the main problem that we were having. So there, the effect on the marble, there are some very special bas-relief sculptures on the monument, and those were having some problems with sugaring where the surface of the marble was coming off. And then we obviously had these water intrusion problems all around the edge of the dome. So in order to stabilize it and to kind of get the systems running for the future, you know, we replaced this gutter in here. This is a shot of some of that work going on. So there was a lot of kind of pulling out the old material that had deteriorated over the years and then replacing it. So this was all work that you can't see, but it was work that affected the systems of the structure basically. And then we did this diagram to sort of, the conservators analyzed how all these problems with staining and water intrusion were happening. And then the architects worked on the systems themselves. So, you know, the way the water was coming through, what we were actually dealing with in terms of the internal composition of the monument, and how these materials were manifesting themselves on the surface. So this was a preservation project, just to preserve the structure as it essentially was. The rehabilitation standards, of course, we'll talk most about today, but just sort of in basic terms, rehabilitation may be considered as a treatment when repair and replacement of deteriorated features are necessary. And this is the key one: alterations or additions to the property are planned for a new or continued use. and when depiction of a property at a particular period of time is not appropriate. So you're not trying to just show, for example, in the last example, what the mausoleum looked like in 1927, which is what, or 1929 when it was completed, which is the case with the last project. In this one, it really, a rehabilitation project is much more sort of inclusive of all different uses that the structure might have. It's often the ones that you're going to use when you're dealing with an adaptive reuse project, which is what most of us are dealing with most of the time. The standards for restoration. I just wanted to do a little case study here and sort of think about what some of the issues are when you're considering a restoration project. So restoration is defined as the act or process of accurately depicting the form, features, and character of a property as it appeared at a particular time by means of removal of features from other periods in history and reconstruction of missing features. So when we sort of generally use these terms, we say, oh, we're going to restore this building, but most of the time we're rehabilitating the building. Restoration is a special case where it says replacement of missing features. This is from standard number 7 of the restoration standards. Replacement of missing features from the restoration period will be substantiated by documentary and physical evidence. So a lot of the time when we're using the rehabilitation standards, we're trying to find what's appropriate and what will help with the interpretation of the building. We're not trying to necessarily get back to exactly the way something was. But we're trying to find at that turning point as the building moves forward in time, what's going to be the best solution to move it forward. In restoration, you're really trying to go back to depict what something looked like at a particular period so you can learn more about it in that period. So this little example that I wanted to give you, this is in Newport, Rhode Island, where I was, I want to give a little plug for the Victorian Society in America's summer schools, which is an excellent program that you should really look into if you're at all interested in 19th century architecture. They also have a program in London and one in Chicago. But so last week, this is what I was, or 2 weeks ago, this is what I was doing. So we came upon this building. This is what it looked like historically. It does not look like that today. And you look at this picture and you think, wow, what is that thing? I mean, it's so unusual. It's from 1884. None of us, I'm sure, have ever seen a building that looks like this. But you don't see what that was until you get to the panel. Oops, where's the... Okay, here we go. I'm going to skip those standards. So when you see the building today, it looks like this on the upper right. But here is another depiction of the way it looked like historically. So you think, okay, so what is that thing? And then fortunately, there's a little informative panel on the next block that says that this is the Flour Cottage from 1882. And I don't know how they got Second Empire for the style here, but I'm going to ignore that. The Flour Cottage was originally the site of John M. Hodgson's florist business. Hodgson supplied extravagant floral decorations for Newport's Gilded Age parties. And I looked at that and I thought, wow, this is really important. I mean, this is a commercial building that helps us understand how all these parties and events actually happened and what the importance was of the interest in gardens and the interest in flowers during this particular period where Newport is really becoming the center for summertime social life on the East Coast. So you can see here that, this is what it looks like today because it was altered in the 20s. But you can see when you look at this, they have this, this drawing that's out here, you can see that it had this extensive gardens and greenhouses that you can see all back behind it. So this was really quite an attraction here. Hodgson's Newport Botanical Gardens it was built at, and you can see people arriving to take a little stroll or maybe arrange for flowers for a party or something. So I look at this and I think, wow, between the important role that it seemed to have historically and the fact that it's this incredible architectural oddity, I would really like to see that restored. But then you have to say, well, okay, so what about what it looks today? Is this important? Is it more important than what it was when it was Hodgson's shop? We're going to have to weigh because if you restore this to its 1882 appearance, more or less, you're going to lose whatever happened in 1921. So you'd have to know enough about the way it currently looks today to know if that's something worth preserving. Then you would also have to weigh the fact that we've got an intact 1921 building, or we know from our research whether we did or not. And we have an 1882 building that we'd really like to see, but maybe all that material is gone. And when it was adapted to a house in 1921, maybe they really got rid of all that stuff, and there's not enough physical evidence to really accurately depict the way it looked in 1882. So these are all the questions that you have to sort of put together in order to decide which treatment approach is the most appropriate. So, I'm assuming that this is probably the way this is going to stay, and that this house that exists, or this florist shop and house that existed in 1882 is essentially gone. And we have to find other ways to interpret it, as they've done in Newport with the panel that's on the block. So the standards for reconstruction, we really don't deal with all that often. When I think of a reconstruction project, I think of the same one you do, Colonial Williamsburg. So this isn't something we do very often. So of course, the only example I was able to find was to go back and look at the one that's actually in the guidelines. And so that's a house in, it's either South or North Carolina, the Kershaw House from 1775, which was reconstructed. It burned down around the time of the Civil War, and then it was reconstructed in the 1970s. So you can see that the 1970s, when this happens, this is 74 to 77. This is right around, this is a Revolutionary War site, and it's right around the time of the bicentennial. So clearly you can see why there was this interest in reconstructing it. Presumably they had enough information. They had some historic photographs. They knew about other houses of the period. They were able to kind of put those details together. And I assume that this is on its original site. And then that allowed them to sort of return it to the story that they were trying to tell here at the edge of this battlefield where this house was located. So, they've got some interpretation up here. There's a panel out there that tells you that it's a reconstruction. This is really important, so you're not looking at the original thing. But the other thing about reconstructions that are tricky is that for code purposes, they're treated as a new building. So you cannot use the State Historic Building Code to justify the characteristics of a reconstructed house. That's just a little bit about the reconstruction standards, which again, I say we don't use very often. So now we're going to go through each of the standards one at a time. And some of them I'm going to kind of buzz by because they're more self-explanatory than others. And also, this is just the beginning 45 minutes of your whole day, so I can't pack everything into this. But if you have any questions, certainly we're going to spend a few minutes at the end, and you can ask for any clarification you'd like. So the first one, the first standard are the rehabilitation standards. A property shall be used for its historic purpose or be placed in a new use that requires minimal change to the defining characteristics of the building and its site and environment. So what's the first thing you need to know once you've established that something is historic? The first thing you need to know is what are the defining characteristics of the building and its site or environment, right? So doing a thorough analysis of character defining features, understanding what all the important features are, is what's going to allow you to evaluate whether the use that's being chosen for it to go forward as an adaptive reuse, for example, is going to be appropriate. So I'm just going to jump right onto the third rail of Pasadena politics here and talk about the YWCA. This is, we're just going to use this as an example because in some ways this starts to get into how the standards all really have to be evaluated together. You can't really separate them out. So when it says a property shall be used for its historic use or be placed in a new use that requires minimal change to the defining characteristics, it says the building and its site and environment. So all three of those things play out differently in this particular project. So this is a Julia Morgan building built between 1921 and 23 in the Pasadena Civic Center. So if you're looking at, when you're evaluating under standard number one, first of all, if you think about a really obvious kind of, basic sort of adaptive reuse, you think of maybe like artist studios, moving into former warehouse or light industrial buildings. So it's perfect because the size is what they need, all the openness. There's a lot of light in an early industrial building, so that's perfect for an artist to use. There's not a high level of finish, so it's okay to have paint splattered everywhere. These are the kinds of things where you're looking at the new use and the historic building's characteristics and seeing if it's a good fit. So it might be the size, it might be, is it an appropriate location? Does the level or type of finishes in the building lend themselves to the kind of use that you're planning for? Is the interior completely open, or is it more compartmentalized? These are the kinds of characteristics that you're going to look at when you're evaluating the building and saying, what is it about this building that we might need to preserve? Are the spaces that you already are given by the historic building fit for the new use? Is there an alignment between the programming of your new use, the spaces that you need for this new use, and what the building is naturally offering you with its historic qualities? Are those two things aligned? So in the case of the Y, this was a project that was being looked at for, or building that was being looked at by Kimpton to adaptively reuse as a hotel. So if you've ever been in a Kimpton hotel, you know that they have sort of a few key spaces that they use. And, you know, one obviously is the lobby. And another one is a sort of a lounge or living room that's separate from the lobby, that's for the use of the guests and has a more intimate feeling to it. And then they always have a restaurant. And then, you know, any hotel would have a large space to use as a ballroom and that kind of thing. So when we look at programmatically, when we look at this is a diagram that ARG did back in, I think we did this in like 2008, before any of these adaptive reuse scenarios were in the picture, just to sort of evaluate on behalf of the city where the most important spaces of the building were, which ones were the least altered, which things in here could be or should be demolished. This is a little addition on the front that has fire damage, this kind of thing. So we marked those things according to this sort of three-tiered hierarchy of what was important about the building, what were the most important spaces, what were the secondary spaces or the spaces that had been altered a little bit, and which ones were really not character defining. So, you know, another thing you need in a hotel is sort of meeting rooms. And, you know, basically when we looked at the plan of the Y, eventually Kimpton got interested in this because it aligned so well with the things that they needed in a hotel. So it's really that kind of fitness, again, for the new use. This is a hospitality building. That's what a YWCA is. And the new use that they were proposing was also a hospitality building. Now, what's missing from this building? Oh, 100 hotel rooms or so. So that's where things got complicated. So far, we're doing great with standard number 1. But when it came to things like the environment of the building and the impact that building that tower would have, I'll get to that a little later in the slideshow about how another standard came into play where some people, you know, had a problem with the way that it was planned. Okay, so standard number 2, the historic character of a property shall be retained and preserved. The removal of historic materials or alteration of features and spaces that characterize a property shall be avoided. Again, I don't have a whole lot on this one because our time is limited and this is fairly self-explanatory, but again, it starts out with knowing the building, knowing its historic characteristics, being able to identify its character-defining features. Yes? Does it apply equally for interior and exterior? Oh gosh, that's such an important question. So to me, as an architectural historian, absolutely. For many of you as city reviewers and planners, not necessarily, because most cities do not regulate the interiors of buildings that are listed. So is that important to sort of like the whole story of the building? Yes, definitely. And I want to say that at any opportunity, so thank you. But the sad truth is that it often does not apply. There's a hierarchy, again, when we talked about this, when we looked at this plan of the Y, you know, the exterior is going to be important when you're looking at the function of, like, if you're trying to get information from this building about how a YWCA functions, then, or you're trying to get information about from this building about what a Julia Morgan YWCA looks like, then yes, the interior is critical because you're going to see this kind of sequence of spaces through it, what the different uses are, and that's going to tell you what the Y was offering to people and how Julia Morgan was addressing those questions and how those problems. So yes, the interior definitely matters, but sadly, it can't always be addressed. Okay. So moving on to number 3, each property shall be recognized as a physical record of its time, place, and use. Changes that create a false sense of historical development, such as adding conjectural features or architectural elements from other buildings, shall not be undertaken. So this is where, when someone comes to you and says, oh, you know, we love this building, we just want it to be more beautiful, that happens kind of a lot. In fact, in one of the examples that you saw today. So that's where you pull out standard number 3 and say, you're not telling the truth about this building if you're trying to enhance it that way. So here's an example to illustrate standard number 3. This is a crank house in Altadena. This is one of the first National Register nominations that I worked on almost 20 years ago, actually 20 years ago. And this house, we nominated this house in Altadena, and it was one of the most significant kind of remaining 19th century houses in Altadena, this like kind of big scale house, a lot of property around it, very significant part of sort of Altadena's development history. But architecturally speaking, it had a few enhancements that had happened along the way. So there were things that had been added. There was a fire that had destroyed the roof at some point, and then they'd kind of they added this Palladian window to the front gable, and these little dormers and things in this little tower to make it kind of like a more perfect colonial revival example. And so when it got to the state commission, they kind of put the brakes on it and said, wait a minute, what about all this stuff that's been added to this building? It's not really telling the truth about what colonial revival looked like in Altadena in 1881. So what we had to do was kind of go back and isolate some of these features that were added. The period of significance ended up going to 1928. So that included things like this Palladian window in the front. But all these other little roof features up here were added after that, after 1944, which is, I think, when that fire was. So we basically brought them some illustrations with the added elements highlighted so they could see what it was limited to and see that you could still see the overall appearance of the building still intact. It was just that there were some things that you would have to read the National Register nomination to know they weren't original. It did go through, it did get listed. So this also kind of speaks to standard number 4. Most properties change over time. Those changes that have acquired significance in their own right shall be retained and preserved. So when we talked about the restoration standards, we're talking about identifying a period of significance and scraping back to that period. This standard allows for the idea that there are probably things that might have happened in later periods to a building that you need to look at too to see if those are also significant. An example might be, let's say you're doing a historic district on a college campus, and you've got some buildings from 1926 to 1930, and you think, yes, great, those are the historic buildings, those are the ones that are important, we need to save, everything else is later. But then if you do some more research, you might find out that there's a building or two that were also done by a significant architect, completely unrelated to the first architect. And so you've got layers of different time periods on that historic district or on a particular building itself that also have meaning, but it might just be a different meaning. So you end up with a different period of significance, a different context for those two layers, and that's what you have to be aware of. So here, this is the example I was just saying, that in 1928, when they added those more layers of of more colonial revival on here, some of these features got picked up in a later period of significance, whereas others are just considered not significant features. So number 5, distinctive features, finishes, and construction techniques or examples of craftsmanship that characterize a property shall be preserved. So this is an example where you might have things that, when you look at the 7 aspects of integrity, this really kind of dovetails with standard number 5. You want to preserve the actual materials from that period. You want to preserve the actual examples of craftsmanship from that period. So making things look perfect is not the goal. Making things sort of speak to what you can learn about that time period is the goal. So it could be that you have something that's very deteriorated and the design of it is more important than the materials. In that case, you might replace the materials. But if it's that particular craftsman who made it, or that, an example of a particular kind of tile from that era, if that's significant, then you're probably going to preserve it, knowing that it's not in the most perfect condition, but accepting that that's the trade-off, is that it's going to give you that information about that actual authentic material or that craftsmanship that's going to carry more meaning than if it was a perfect replacement. So when we talk about features and finishes, this is something that happens a lot. And in the city of Los Angeles, this has been a real controversy. This is a example of what's happening in downtown Los Angeles now, the creative office space phenomenon. So everybody wants creative office space like this building. And not everybody is lucky enough to have an old wire factory to convert. So, well, we've got this beautiful, neoclassical kind of Beaux-Arts style high rise, why don't we make it into creative office space? Well, that's what they're doing, but I'll tell you why there's a problem with this. It's because when you walk into this building and you see this interior, there's a real disjointedness between what is this building about? Who historically used this building? What were the finishes actually like? What was the layout like? Because it was not, like people say, oh, it's more historic with this exposed brick, but nobody in this building would have ever seen a speck of exposed brick. So it's really kind of giving people, again, this sort of false sense of history to say, it's not that we don't think that this is attractive, aesthetically. I mean, these are really cool spaces in this building. But the truth is that it has nothing to do with the exterior. It has nothing to do with the progression through this beautiful lobby that's covered in marble and balustraded staircases everywhere. And then, you come through that environment and then you end up here. And yeah, this is great, but what building does it really belong to? So it's a matter of, again, with the city of LA, I think what they've really done is buildings that have Mills Act contracts and are held to a higher standard, they're not getting away with this kind of thing. It's trying to keep that kind of thing over in the arts district where it maybe belongs more and keep it out of the sort of grand multi-story office buildings in downtown. Number 6. Deteriorated historic features shall be repaired rather than replaced. This, again, why? Because of what we talked about here in standard number 5. Where the severity of deterioration requires replacement of a distinctive feature, the new feature shall match the old in design, color, texture, and other visual qualities, and where possible, materials. So in some cases, you might have some wood trim on a building that's missing in spots or deteriorated, and they'll come to you and say, is it okay if we put molded, I can't remember the name for this high density styrofoam. They don't like it when you call it styrofoam. But, can we use that instead? There may be cases where that's okay. There may be cases where that's not okay, because if you've got that next to a piece of wood, you're going to get aging at different rates, and over time that's not going to hold up. It might also be that, if this is a building that's kind of about wood construction and you go and start replacing the parts with styrofoam, it's kind of like weird plastic surgery at a certain point. So trying to kind of keep that material authenticity of the building, trying to preserve its integrity. In some cases, like, for example, we had one case where it was on a large hospital that was being converted for under tax credits to senior housing. And there were 2 windows, big windows, flanking the front door. And one of them still had the original iron grill. And the other one, or actually like just a little cornice on top, that it was sort of a decorative iron thing. And the other one, it was missing. And so we had the original one to mold it off of, but they asked if they could use a different material. And we sort of researched that material, and they convinced us that it was tried enough that it would essentially always mirror what was happening on the other window with the original material. So there are some cases where the type of project it is, the budget, the significance of the building say, you know what, it's going to be okay if you do it this way. But in other cases, you just have to be able to make those judgment calls about, based on all those things, what's the significance of the building, what's the significance of the material, what's the significance of that feature, to decide just how hard you're going to lean on this standard. So this is a project that Christy's going to show later. But I just wanted to note that this is, sorry, you can't really see that, but this is a little excerpt just to give you an idea of what is in the guidelines. So when we're talking about the standards, they fit on one page. You've really got to go to the guidelines to understand how to apply them. So I'm giving you kind of the short version, but this has lots of examples in it, and lots of places where it kind of talks you through how to apply them. So for example, it says, next, when the physical condition of character-defining materials and features requires additional work, repairing by stabilizing, consolidating, and conserving is recommended. But then if you move down to this next part here, it says, if repair by stabilization, consolidation, and conservation proves inadequate, then what do you do? So, page by page, it takes you through how to apply all these things and how to sort of understand the philosophy behind them. Okay, so 7, chemical or physical treatment such as sandblasting that cause damage to historic material should not be used. If you've ever seen Nels Youngborg from Chattel, he gives this presentation about the Mills Act where every 5 or 6 minutes he says, "Do not sandblast." So I think that sticks in everybody's mind. So why is that? Because these techniques, if they're not used properly, cause damage to historic materials. So it says the surface cleaning of structures, if appropriate, shall be undertaken using the gentlest means possible. So yes, sometimes the buildup of dirt or biogrowth or whatever is on the building could be harming the materials, but then you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and blast it all off and also take the surface with it. So if you think about something like brick, brick is a material that's fired, and the exterior has different properties than what's below the surface. And so when you blast the brick, you get just horrible conditions like this where it just gets completely eaten off. And this was done pretty aggressively, and this is also a later addition on this building. This part down here, which was the original brick, didn't fare quite so badly in the sandblasting, but it's still really obvious. This is just, comparatively not as bad. This is bad too. So, here's a building where it was sandblasted. The entire thing now has this skin on it that is going to absorb moisture at a different rate. It has a terrible appearance. When you go back to repoint it, you don't have a nice edge of the brick. So that's the problem under standard number 7. But then you've also got a real problem here under one of the earlier standards. Distinctive features, finishes, and construction techniques are examples of craftsmanship that characterize a property shall be preserved. Well, here's an early picture of this building that you see here. This is looking the other way through the courtyard. This whole building was brick painted white originally. And at some point, somebody, I think in the 60s, when they did all these little additions, said, "Oh, look at all this exposed brick. Let's get all this paint. Oh, what a shame that somebody painted this." Well, either they thought that, or they thought, "Oh, it would have been great if this thing hadn't been painted originally." Well, they were imposing their own 1966 or whatever vision of what a historic building should look like on the 1927 building. This is Arcade Lane in Pasadena. And so instead of having this kind of, it's a Spanish colonial revival building essentially that had this white finish on it with the brick, showing through for texture, which was, I happen to love the way that looks, but somebody in the 60s did not, and they either didn't care or didn't look at the earlier photos, or they just made a different decision and decided to sandblast all the paint off of it. So now for generations, we've known this building in Pasadena as an exposed brick building, but the truth is that it was always painted like this. So again, they did something that was both damaging to the material and not historically accurate. Okay, I'm not really going to talk about standard number 8 because you'll find other sources for this if you need it. This is significant archaeological resources affected by a project shall be protected and preserved. If such resources must be disturbed, mitigation measures shall be undertaken. I rarely deal with this. It comes up, under CEQA, certainly it comes up. And fortunately, we have an archaeologist in our office who I kind of defer to, and usually between myself and her and the people at the city who've been dealing with it, we usually come up with some kind of plan that says basically like your mitigation, if you have an impact under standard 8, is make a plan to deal with it if you find anything, and do your investigations carefully to make sure that nothing is there that you're going to disturb by coming through with a bulldozer in the first place. So again, with your research, know what used to be there, know what the sensitivities of that site might be. Is it near a water source? Is it near some kind of early settlement? And plan accordingly. Okay, so now for number 9. New additions, exterior alterations, or related new construction shall not destroy historic materials that characterize the property. The new work shall be differentiated from the old and shall be compatible with the massing, size, scale, and architectural features to protect the historic integrity of the property and its environment. So I'm going to do that whole concept and the concept of number 10 in just 10 minutes here, because you're going to talk about it all day. So this, again, I said I would get back to the why. So now we're talking about compatible to protect the historic integrity of the property and its environment. So here we had a significant historic building, a Julia Morgan YWCA, which you see right here. And you also see this is Pasadena City Hall looking westward on Holly Street right there. So it's right at this main axis of the Pasadena Civic Center, which is a National Register Historic District. The YWCA building is, again, this kind of elongated C shape right here with an empty lot that's been there probably since they tore that last house down in the 40s or 50s. So what was proposed in order to supply the hotel rooms that were needed was to build a block like this that would kind of fit in as an L shape and fit into the C shape, sort of in an interlocking way on the block, to sort of round out this block and complete this block. Now, what happened in a nutshell was that between the time that Kimpton was awarded this project and given the lease by the city, and they actually started to crunch numbers as they were starting to go into design, what happened was that a lot of costs had gone up, and they decided that they needed more rooms than they had initially proposed. So that made a lot of people upset. And what it also did was it pushed the land that they'd been given a lease to actually overlapped with this park right here. And that really made people mad. So that is the main reason why this whole project was scuttled, because of that impact on the historic property and its environment. So I think people didn't have a problem with what was going to happen over here on the west side of the property. What they had a problem with was what was happening on the east side, because if you really honor the Y and make this the main entrance to the building, that inevitably means that this is the back of the building. But this back of the building is right here facing City Hall. It's very important. So we had kind of a built-in conundrum with the back in front of the building, and also the fact that it was starting to encroach size-wise onto the park, or else it just gets too tall. So we went through a lot of community meetings and this kind of thing trying to solve this problem, and just, you know, that was the choice. Basically, either the building is too big, too tall, or it encroaches on the park. So this was, again, this was the face that was proposed by City Hall, and I think people looked at that and it looked kind of scary, but this is how big it is in relation to City Hall. It's actually below the ridge line of the lower block of City Hall, which is exactly what the design guidelines for this area call for. It was really the issue of the park, and the fact that I think that people really wanted this to be a public building and not a private hotel. Okay, number 10, new additions and adjacent or related new construction shall be undertaken in such a manner that if removed in the future, the essential form and integrity of the historic property and its environment would be unimpaired. So this really, you know, these two standards really talk about, you know, the word that they use is differentiation. And I was reading something that said that deference is really the word that a lot of people wish would be used more often. So that the addition or the new building would defer to the historic building. That doesn't mean that it has to be less interesting than the historic building, but that it should be clear that the historic building is the prominent thing that's kind of driving the complex, and that the addition is deferring to it. So this is another example from back east that I saw last week. This is the Ames Free Library in Massachusetts. This is a building by Henry Hobson Richardson from 1882. And this is the front of it. And then this is the back. So in 1931, Shepley, Rattan, and Coolidge, who are the successor firm to Richardson, came in to design an addition to the back. So, you know, I think this is just really masterfully done. And in 1931, you know, I think the reason this was able to happen in such a deferential way is because, for one thing, the same architectural principles were kind of at play. You weren't dealing with like a 1960s addition to an 1880s building. But also because Shepley, Rattan, and Coolidge knew that this was a Richardson building, and it was essentially their legacy that they were adding on to. So you can see what they did. There's a number of things that they did to distinguish it. This is faced in brick. The original building is faced in stone. It's actually set away from the back of the old building. It is lower in height than the old building. And of course, it's on the rear. So there's just a number of things that they did to, you know, you can also see the volume of the original building really clearly here. And this window down here on the sort of lower left of the building is an important reading room. So you didn't want to mess up the reading room. You wanted to be able to add the space in a way that was compatible with the old building, but you didn't want to sort of create more 1882. So I think they did a pretty remarkable job for that in 1931. And then at some point more recently, they had to add an elevator to this building. So you can see how that elevator was kind of slotted in here. Again, it's on the back of the building. It's in a material that's distinguishable from both the original Richardson building and the Shepley, Rutan, and Coolidge addition. It's in this kind of colored concrete block, and with this kind of copper canopy, so that the materials sort of tie in a little bit in terms of their color and their solidity and all that. But you can see how there's that slot in here where it's set away from the old building. And then you can also see that when you look at it, it's just sort of in the context of the whole rear of the building. This is sort of the view, a main view coming up from the parking lot, this lower left view. You can see how there's this one little tower here to kind of make it blend in with all the other gables and hips on the roof line, but that it's distinct from everything else that's on the back of the building. So I was pretty impressed with this. And then you go on the inside. This is the main Richardson reading room over here on the left. And in the middle here, this is the inside of that children's wing that was built in 1931. So you can see that it still has like a lot of that kind of, it's symmetrical. It has this kind of nice kind of sandy plaster texture and this really soft color. It's got this big, beautiful window at the end that's kind of the focus of the access through it. But it's definitely not trying to out Richardson. It's very subtle. It's less expensive, of course. They probably had less of a budget to do this in 31. It's not a public library. It's actually, it wasn't built as a public library. It was actually built by a family, kind of like how Carnegie sponsored libraries. The Ames family had a huge impact on this town with Richardson and built, several kind of buildings for public use. And one of them was this free library, which just means that it wasn't a subscription library. So again, differentiated from the old, compatible with the massing, size, scale, and architectural features to protect the historic integrity of the property and its environment. So the other thing that's going on here, if we go back a slide, is that this is all set in a landscape that was designed by Olmsted. So the combination of Richardson and Olmsted, again, once you know that Olmsted is involved, you think, okay, we're not just dealing with this one building, we're also better look at, if we're going to add on to this building, how is it going to impact this Olmsted landscape that it's surrounded by? So again, the front is really kind of the most important perspective. The rear was less significant, another reason to kind of maintain this 1882 appearance in the front. Okay. Oh, good timing for once. Sorry. So this, again, just to remind you of some of the resources that are out there. Yes. Yeah, the reversibility. Yeah, I mean, this is tricky because obviously there's a big opening between this building and its addition. So I think that one of the things that, like, if this had been done today, I think that what you would have seen is probably like a glass connector, what they call a hyphen sometimes, between the old building and the new, so that from this angle in the lower left, you wouldn't necessarily see it. But as soon as you walked up to it, into this slot right here, essentially, you would see glass. And then what you would do is when you entered through that glass passageway, you would see the old brick or the old stone wall there on one side, and you would see the 1930 brick wall on the other side. So that's a way to kind of emphasize the fact that this is just something kind of gently holding these things two things together, and not necessarily like, building in a heavy way onto the building. So that's, that's one example. And when you look at this preservation brief number 14, there's an example of it right there, in fact, right on the cover. So yeah, so the reversibility, a lot of the times it might mean taking some materials off and storing them in the basement, in case that's ever rethought, that interface between the addition and the main building. It might mean just pulling it away from the main building and having some kind of a more gentle connector between the two, some kind of little bridge that goes through. There's lots of ways that can be handled, but the general idea is that you can still see what the original building was, and that you don't get this feeling like, well, if we tear this thing off, then we're going to have a big gaping hole in the side of the building that, that we can't ever go back to it being whole. Does that answer your question? Okay. Okay, anybody else have any other questions about any of this? Yes.
Okay, just a quick reminder. We need to use microphones for questions because people are online.
Sure.
So I'm sure they want to hear the questions as well.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Going back to the restoration project, I believe it was 1882, the Florist Building, significantly altered in 1921.
Yep.
Who was the client and who makes the call as to what to do in a situation like that?
Yeah, good question. Okay, so in this case, there's no project. This is just, I use this just for speculative purposes. But in this case, this is a single family house. So let's say that I moved to Newport and bought this house and I went, oh, I really want it to look like it did in 1882. Then I would probably have to work with the city and they would ask those same questions that I just presented to you guys. Well, is there any 1882 material actually left in there? Is the 1921 just as significant as the 1882 and we shouldn't destroy it to get to something that doesn't really have evidence for it? So, you know, a lot of this, it wouldn't ever be anything that was imposed from above. It would be something that would come from the property owner probably. Just like, this is my idea of what this building really ought to be. Is this okay? Just like any of the other standards.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Anything else?
Okay, I actually have a question.
Yes.
So if you could go back to standard number 6.
Yep.
Because I don't memorize these things by heart.
Yeah, I know.
So yesterday I went to a sort of a architectural salvage shop, and they not only sell salvage items, but they sell salvage items that were reproductions of earlier items, and they also sell new reproductions of old items that they can't find or salvage. So going back to the standard number 6, you're looking at the new feature shall match the old in design, color, texture, and other visual qualities. Replacement of missing features shall be substantiated by documentary, physical, or pictorial evidence.
Yep.
So if an item, say it's a piece of door hardware, is missing from a historic building and for whatever reason you're not able to find the original, is it safe to say that you can reproduce something, new construction, as long as you have a photograph of that item or some sort of documentation that would prove that it looked exactly like that?
Definitely. I mean, you know, again, these are the rehabilitation standards, so there's more flexibility. But let's say that all the knobs were missing in the Gamble house. You know, in that case, if you had photographs of one of the knobs and you really had enough information and maybe there was another green and greenhouse that had a knob like that and you could reproduce it from that, you know, you wouldn't reproduce it in high density styrofoam, but because it's the Gamble house, but you would, you know, you'd want to know what the metal was. You know, you'd want to probably either reproduce the patina so that it would age to that, you know, to the proper point. But you would want to have as much information as possible so that, you know, for example, sometimes you'll see a house that's been rehabbed and things were missing, and the things that they sub in for the things that are missing are not authentic to the period or authentic to the style. And sometimes they want to bump it up and make it more exciting, or sometimes they want to make it less expensive. And then you end up with something that's not in line with everything else about the house. So again, it's really just sort of knowing. I mean, it's interesting. I was thinking of some of the work that we've done in Anaheim with Christy. Sometimes there'll be a steel window missing. And it's very expensive to get a new steel window made, but there are a lot of steel windows out there on the secondary market. And if you knew that that's what it looked like, there would be nothing wrong really with going and getting a salvage window as long as you knew the dimensions were correct, because they're standard products in 1938 or whatever. So, you know, they were the same often from building to building. So as long as you weren't altering the house to make that salvage piece fit, then there would really be no problem in using older salvage material. The question is, like, what are you having to do to the building in order to make that salvage piece work? Is it better to just reproduce something if you know what it looked like and have it custom made for that building? Or is that going to be out of the budget of the project? So, I mean, you're talking about like really complex layers of reproduction of things.
Right. I might make it a bit more complicated now. So if you have a reproduction that looks new, clearly looks new, doesn't have the patina on it that you would want for an older building. And maybe this is where it gets into one of the other standards about conjectural kind of false historicism. It wouldn't be appropriate to give it a bit of patina to make it look like it's old, right?
Yeah, again, that's a kind of question that can be only answered in the context of the project as a whole. But if you had, let's say you had a whole bunch of different latches on all the windows and one of them had been missing and you got a new one that was the same design, it's not that critical that that one latch be distinguished from the original because it's essentially you're just replacing like for like. So in the cases where we really are replacing in kind in terms of the material and the design, the dimensions, all those things, then it is, and it's just like a small part of the whole, then, you don't need to go out of your way usually to make sure that it's understood that this is a reproduction. It's just, it's kind of a subtle,
Right.
Yeah, a subtle call to make, but yeah, it's,
Great.
yeah, I think in most rehabilitation projects, people don't have to go to that length.
Thank you. I will give one final chance for people online to ask any questions.
Okay.
I don't see any right now, but does anybody else in the room have any questions?
Okay. All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have about 10 minutes. So feel free to grab some food and coffee. We'll be back here at 15 after the hour. So I'll see you here at 15 after.